Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Young Screenwriters Podcast. I'm Alexie, and I'm here today with Adam and Theo, and we are talking about Dune Part 2. We're going to kind of look at it broadly from a story point of view. We're going to talk about anti-heroes, the controversial themes, and also I definitely want to touch on how the heck they kept it under a $200 million budget and how they got a PG-13 rating, because both of those things are just wild. But yeah, I guess thank you for coming. And what was your all's just initial first impressions of Dune Part 2?
You go first, Adam.
Oh, I was really on board for the ride. I think, engrossed in the spectacle. It was funny. The movie was way funnier than I went in. Me and my friend who we watched it with, we made like a Dune bingo card. And on the Dune bingo card, we're going to have like, okay, the Baron's going to take a bath X amount of times. We're going to see what Fremen food looks like. And then one of them was, there's only going to be 2 jokes in the movie max. There were like 20 funny moments that I thought Javier Bardem's character was so funny. And there was a lot of like actual humanity in this movie that I thought the first movie didn't have. So I laughed. I did not cry. I was not, but I laughed and I got excited by a sandworm. And I thought Austin Butler was surprisingly ferocious and terrifying. The Gaty Prime stuff was so alien and strange. So I was like very into it. And by the end, I was like, this is about as good as an adaptation as this could have been, I think, with the exception of one major thing that I really thought took me out of the film that I'd love to talk about later. But Theo, what about you?
Oh, well, what I will say about this film is that I have never completely read Dune because it looked boring to me, to be quite honest. But watching this film and watching, like an adaptation is basically seeing the reading experience through somebody else's eyes, right? So this is like Denis Villeneuve's experience of reading Dune. And I the whole time I sat there thinking, I would read this book if I could get this experience from it. So I want to try to read the book, because what I loved the most about it, honestly, was like the first like half hour, which my husband did not. He was like totally did not know what was happening in that. But for me, like seeing all of these like small moments of like the Fremen, like all of their mythologies and all of the religious rites that they've developed on this planet was, to me, that was mind blowing. And the experience of it was really satisfying for me. And that was like my high for it. And that set me up for the rest of the movie.
For sure. I loved the beginning as well. I also just really liked seeing, I'm always a sucker for when they create languages for movies and then the actors can deliver it so convincingly. I'm just like, how are you so good at this? So I'm always a sucker for that kind of a thing. But I have to say, one of my favorite moments was when Paul chose his Fremen name right after writing the sandworm. That was probably like one of the highs for me. I was just like, yeah, this feels cinematic and cool. And then honestly, then my second favorite part was that intense speech that Paul gave when he was like going south, when he ran in. I feel like the performance there was just so good, because leading up to it, I'm kind of like, he's like this, small kind of scrawny kid who like is doing his best in this world and is like figuring things out as he goes. But I didn't yet see him as someone who could like command a religion, if that makes sense. And that scene completely changed my mind. I was just like, this guy has authority. He like can wield power. And it was just such an impressive performance that I was really blown away by it personally. Adam, I'm curious what part you thought didn't work.
It's not a story thing, it's a casting thing. I thought Christopher Walken's performance was so insanely lame and like non-existent. And it was Christopher Walken. It was Christopher Walken. Like, he wasn't doing it. He was just, I was like, what? Why is he here? I don't believe he's Emperor of the Universe. It was so strange because there's the casting and acting throughout is so convincing and great. And I was like, they could have had any old white guy. And there's so many good old white guy actors who are famous, and they get a character actor with whose voice you can't like, I want somebody who like feels like the role of that, and I just saw Christopher Walken. So for me, that was the only real. What was that?
It's hard not to see Christopher Walken in anything that he plays, right? Like he's so distinct.
Arrakis will be yours, you know. It's like, that wasn't a good one, but yeah, that took me out, unfortunately, a little bit. But it was a minor issue for me.
I see. I definitely see what you mean, though. Everybody else was delivering on such a high level. Like Zendaya was freaking phenomenal. Austin Butler, like we just discussed, like I didn't even recognize him. I mean, granted, he was bald and stuff, but I mean, everybody else was completely killing it. And yeah, I agree. I agree with Oil Man. That was a great walk-in, Adam.
It was mediocre at best.
But our girl Anya Taylor-Joy, like she had about 0.5 of a second in that film, and I was like screaming about it. I loved her.
Mm-hmm.
I really wonder, and this is, I don't want to talk about the hypothetical third film too much, but I have so many questions about how they're going to adapt Dune Messiah into a sequel, and a lot of the things that they're setting up for the sequel in this film, which included Anya Taylor-Joy's character, and some changes they made to the book. Spoiler territory, obviously, we're all going to talk the spoilers, but two big changes they made, which I think they were all changes for the better. I think they improved the book in a lot of ways. They did not have Paul's sister born in the book, born, and like they have a multiple year time skip, and they do a thing where because Jessica drank the water of life and got like 10,000 years of Bene Gesserit consciousness into her, and the baby does too. The baby doesn't really have a time to develop a consciousness and ego of its own, so they call it's an Bene Gesserit abomination, right? It's a fetus that has the memories of 10,000 things, 10,000 years, right? But then we see the girl, his sister, is like 3-4 years old in the book, and that changes. There's a lot of like time spent on that, and it's a character they develop, and I thought that cutting that out altogether, saving that for the next book, it was a very smart choice, because there wasn't really time. There was more time to spend on Chani and Paul's relationship, I think, right? And they expanded that tremendously. And the other change they made, which I loved, is they made Chani a skeptic. Like there are skeptics in the Dune book, but in the book she's kind of like this, you know, she's like Paul's ride or die, basically, you know, and it's kind of, they took like kind of a two-dimensional character and they made her a character who actually believed something that created conflict and was interesting. And I thought what they did with Chani's character, setting her up as kind of a foil for exposing all these ideas about like flawed prophecy, like he's in the book. One of the big problems of the book is by the end of it, you're like, yeah, go Paul, take over the universe, jihad, whatever they call it, jihad in the book, and not holy war. And you don't really get a sense of like, hey, 60 billion people are about to die off screen, you know? And I thought they did a better job of showing that, hey, Paul's kind of becoming kind of evil. He's using this fake religion to prop himself up as the emperor of the universe. It's kind of shitty.
Yeah, and I was watching the director talk about that too, and was kind of saying that, you know, the author, you and we just talked about this briefly before, but the author was disappointed with the reception of his book and the way that Paul was seen as a hero and like a messiah in a good way, rather than this anti-hero that he had intended to write. And then he wrote a second book that was supposed to be like kind of an epilogue, if I'm not mistaken, that was attempting to kind of adjust for that. And by making Chani a skeptic, we gave a voice to what the author originally kind of wanted us to be feeling, I think. You know, like it kind of helped add a perspective where now we have somebody who's persuasive and doubting him, that presents that alternate point of view. And I still think people think that Paul's supposed to be a hero, right? Like
they do.
People are still getting that impression.
Definitely.
And I really want to talk about Paul as an anti-hero and kind of like how the story built up Paul as someone with promise and then is kind of destroying him through his quest for power, or corrupting. He's getting corrupted through his like quest for power, things like that.
Like,
Yeah,
I
and
think part of it is that he
Yeah, you
rides
go.
a giant worm, and it's really cool. And a lot of people are going to see that and immediately think, "Wow, this guy's so cool. He just rode a big giant worm." Like, and I think some of it is just as simple as that. This guy's doing cool things. Why shouldn't we follow him? And I think that that is human nature, to have those thoughts when you see these things happening. And it does take like quite a bit of critical thinking skills to be able to look underneath of that. So I think that creating less subtlety and more conflict was a really great conscious choice in that. And I think that's something that's very true of a lot of adaptations that you have to do, is that in novels, you don't always need to have that much conflict right kind of on the page, because you have more time to play with it and, expand on it in thoughts. But in a movie, like if you are writing an adaptation, you really have to look at every character and think, okay, how can they be conflicting against one another?
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Absolutely. Writing the sandworm was just so triumphant and cool and good that I was like, that was definitely, like, that sequence, like I said, was one of my favorite ones in the movie, where he calls the sandworm, and then after, when he gets his name, it felt so cool. And I totally get how people kind of we kind of fall into the spectacle in the same way that the Fremen do. The Fremen who follow him fall into his spectacle. And it was really powerful and effective. It was, by the end, I was kind of like, he is getting these visions from the future, right? So like, is he wrong? Or is he right?
Because he has an excuse, right? Because he basically says, okay, well, I've seen the future, and the only future in which all of you don't die is the one where I take power. And we kind of have to say, okay, do we take him on faith on that, or is he just doing his thing?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've read the whole series, and I think Frank Herbert is a very talented in some ways, very not talented in others. I'll say the characterization is weak in the Dune books, the interpersonal conflict, in my opinion, but the world building and the focus on ecology and politics and like this, the ideas are brilliant and so wonderfully realized. This idea of you get visions from the future, right? The Kwisatz Haderach are trying to create, like the mind that can bridge space and time. The thing about it is that it's kind of short-term vision, right? Like he's definitely seeing, like you notice that all his indecision goes away when he drinks the water of life. Like he sees completely. A vision, he changes completely, he becomes decisive in the act, right? Like he gets some information that like makes him like not question the sacrifice at all, right? And not to spoil the later books too much, but there is definitely something he's seeing, right? That makes him go, I need to be the one in power. But what I think was really the interesting idea about that, I think that's expressed in the books, is anyone who sees something like that or makes a connection wants to be the one in power. People who are like senators who spend 40 years in power, they don't want to give up their spot. People don't want to give up their spot in the Supreme Court. When you have power and you feel like you can make a change, you don't want to step away from it, right? And what he sees in the vision is what he can do, and possibly potential dangers. And in the book, obviously, there are other people who develop powers even greater to see the future, who become even worse, like his son. For example, he turns into a giant worm. Spoiler. The books get really weird. This is
what I've heard. I've heard that they get like very like off kilter.
They get off kilter. I could only honestly recommend the first one to people. And that's why I'm curious about what they'll do to improve Dune Messiah, because I think it's literally, you could make a 90-minute movie of people talking in rooms, and that would be the movie. Like nothing really happens other than like courtroom politics. Like there's no big sequences. There's no big like good versus evil narrative. It's palace intrigue, right? So I don't know how that would be out there. I'm rambling a little bit, but I think it is interesting. Like when you have power, you don't want to get rid of it, right? And seeing the future is a form of power.
Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
I
can never remember who said that. It was somebody.
A lot of people now.
So many people have said that. But from a screenwriting point of view, I wonder, Alexie and Theo, what do you think about? You've been talking about how you love the first part. You love the falling in love with the Fremen world. Like those are all the scenes you guys are talking about. Did you feel like there was like a loss of energy into Act 2?
Not for me.
Mm-mm.
I will say, like, the discussion that I had with my husband, who watches movies in a very different way than I do, was he thought that the first act really dragged, and then it kind of picked up for him, and then he was interested, which I thought was interesting, because I was into Act 1, like I was like edge of my seat. You know,
me
I
too.
also like I took a gummy for the movie, so I was in it, like I was experiencing it with the cast. And for me, everything just kind of, the depth just got deeper, because I was really in it with Paul, and I was feeling this, like, you know, I believed him when I was watching it. I believed that he thought this was the only path that would save lives. And I believed it. And that, I think, made it all the more heartbreaking with every decision. Like, you know, when he breaks Chani's heart, like that just like killed me.
Mm-hmm.
So I just was in it. I thought that, like, having that like really intense exploration in the first act, and then ramping it up with like all of this action moving throughout the movie, I think that's what kept the pacing good for me.
I agree. I think the beginning was like, it was definitely slower paced in a lot of ways, but I was really intrigued by like the fact that they were pushing all this stuff on the mom with the water of life, and like, you know, that they thought that they were spies. I think that there was enough conflict there that I was into it. And then I just love world building so much. And I never really felt like they went down super far paths of just world building. It felt like everything had a purpose. So that for me was like, I love this. This is in my zone. I am super excited about this. But you know, when it kind of picked up with the sandworm and like him more embracing the prophecy and stuff, at that point I was just down. Like they made so many cool choices, and I know that we're talking about the screenwriting, but it was just, you know, the one planet where everything is under like a black sun was just insane. I loved that. But yeah, I mean, the thing that I was thinking about is when you watch it, you're really, really sucked into his charisma. And then it's kind of in like later reflections, at least for me, that you're like, well, wait, what if he's wrong? Like, what if this isn't the truth? And Adam, you said it before. It's like he went from kind of not sure to decisive after he drank that water. But we don't actually know that what he's decisive about is correct. We didn't see his visions. We don't know what he saw. It's just now we see a guy who's decisive. And from the outside, that's really the only thing that changed, is how authoritative and decisive he is. And his, kind of like his wielding of his charisma. And that mirrors in a lot of ways, I think, the kind of situations in politics that we see today. It's like when someone is has a lot of conviction and is very sure of their view, what they're basing it on kind of becomes secondary to a lot of people. And I thought that was really interesting and scary.
There was humor too that I thought was so interesting. Like in that moment, there was a moment early on where Paul was like, I don't want this. And then the guy's like, even more of a sign that he's the Messiah. I was like, oh, so good.
He's so humble. He's so humble, you know.
You know, because they made their decision long ago, and anything that would happen, they will bend and twist to make it suit what they want to be true. And I think that was like a really apt point, at least for me.
And one thing I'd love to talk about a little bit is like, okay, so we're talking a lot about, you know, Paul's decision and, you know, how he sort of manipulated or took advantage of that devotion. I think his mother is one of the most important characters in the story, in the sense of she's an active colonizer, right? She's a member of this organization that created this false religion, right? And she, after she drinks the water of life, becomes basically an evangelist manipulator for Paul. And as you could almost say in the story, is his mentor figure. She's the one who tells him, you've got to drink the water. You've got to become this. Don't question. You've got to manipulate this belief into you for power and leverage it. You have to, right? And she's kind of the villain of the story and his mentor in a way, if you want to follow the anti-hero sort of frame. Her character is really interesting to me. Like how she took advantage of the masses and this belief.
That was kind of like a recurring thing, right? It's kind of like the insidious people behind the scenes, like the priestess lady. I do not know all the names of all these people, but the priestess lady back with Florence Pugh, where she was like, of course I was the one who said to kill the whole family. Like, who do you think gave him that idea? And then the same thing with the mom is that she assumed this really powerful leadership position that's kind of, played down by the fact that it's religious in a way. Like, it's supposed to be spiritual, not like a power grab, but she's definitely wielding a lot of power. And it's a really interesting dynamic that so much stuff is driven by these specifically women behind the scenes was an interesting recurring theme.
And then there's the baby who's Austin Butler's character. Sorry, let's see, Fade Ralpha, the Bene Gesserit got one of their sisters impregnated with his baby as an alternative to Paul, which is kind of an interesting subplot. I wonder if they're going to take advantage of that in the third movie.
They brought that up, didn't they?
Oh yeah, it's explicitly said because she seduced him, and then she said, "A girl for you, your Reverend Mother." Yeah, that's a whole plot line that's going on.
Yeah,
is interesting because that's not in the book, I believe. It's
really?
implied, but it's not explicit now. There's a lot of new stuff that I think that there were a lot of new scenes and that were very much conflict affirming. I shall say.
It's convinced me to read it. I really I'm gonna read it, and I've told myself for years, like every time I looked at Dune, I was like, do I want to get into that whole thing? But seeing Denis Villeneuve's perspective is interesting for me. If I can read the book and get that perspective, then I know that I will love it.
Well, it's kind of like
the film is very close to what I imagined when I was reading it as a child. That it even aesthetically, it is the book. It's very faithful.
Yeah, it's like the movie reads though about the director saying, "This is what I loved about it," right? And so it definitely makes the whole thing more appealing to me than when I read the description and it's like, oh, and then there's a giant sandworm. It's like it was much more immersive and interesting.
Well, the idea that I think the sandworms are kind of representative of is this idea of ecology and the way human and the Fremen. Dune was very much inspired by Frank Herbert's sort of, I'll just say, fanboying of Islamic cultures and the way they sort of interact with the desert and how human beings can change the ecology of a place and change the ecosystem by participating in it, right? And there's this sense of you have the worms and you have the spice and you have the people who live in the sand dunes and who participate in this system, and the system exists because of the people who live in it. There's a natural ecosystem that exists with or without people, like sand dunes. There's a replenishing environment, right? But the moment you introduce human beings who live in a sustainable, sustainable relationship with that environment, the people become part of that fundamentally, and the cultures around that is all sort of very rich and interesting. And the movie does a great job of sort of teasing that.
The water, the well that they have that is full of water, and they are parched. Everybody's parched in this world, and they just have this giant swimming pool of water that's just chilling because it's holy.
And it's only dead people. It's only their people.
The dead water.
Dead people water.
That was a huge sacrifice when the siege was destroyed by the Harkonnens. Yeah. I was dying when I saw that water get covered in rock. You're ugh.
Well, part of it for me was I thought that maybe I misunderstood it, but part of what he said in that moment was something we're gonna make the whole desert flourish with basically our dead body water. And so part of me was oh my God, I can't believe they shattered these people's water. But then also it was kind of that's sort of if I didn't, I don't know anything about where it's going. So for me, I was kind of well, that might be kind of symbolic of well, they weren't necessarily ready, but their water is getting returned to the desert. And there's something kind of poetic about that. But for all I know, it just evaporates and we're done. So Who, I guess Adam knows, but I don't know exactly what their fate is.
I haven't totally spoiled
It's all
myself.
about
I've read like a lot, but mostly just
what's said in the movie.
Which part?
Right? The vision with Anya to see the future, and we see his sister growing up, and there's an ocean.
Oh,
right?
well, yeah. I wasn't necessarily sure if those visions, how true those visions are. Like there was like a unreliable narrator aspect to it, where it was
they're
like
possible futures. Like
Yeah.
the way foresight works in the Dune universe is you're constantly seeing like cycles of possibilities, and you also understand what leads to those possibilities.
Yeah.
So like Paul like the reason why he's certain is that he saw a possible future he wants, and he knows that all the futures that lead to where he wants to go, people in his, and also it's not just self-sacrifice, it's his family and him. Like the only way he lives is taking power, right? There's no way he doesn't, right? It's not just a selfless, oh, I want to save the Fremen, you know?
Yeah.
Anyway.
No, and the other thing I really wanted to talk about is just how far they went with this anti-Messiah theme. I thought that was really interesting. And Adam, I know you and Avi had a conversation about that. It was kind of like that you were happy that they had actually leaned into it, perhaps even harder than the books.
Well, the books really lean hard into it. The first book didn't lean hard enough into it, and Frank Herbert was really annoyed that people didn't pick up on it, because his whole thing is that charismatic leaders, you know, whether coming from a good place or a bad place, increases the amount of people who do things thoughtlessly in their name, right? Like it's not so much like for him, JFK was the most dangerous president at the time, right? Like in retrospect, it's funny, but you know, for him, it's like, wow, all these people, there's this handsome, charismatic person who people will follow and do things for and break rules for. That will create systems and effects, you know, beyond that individual's control. So it doesn't really matter, aside from like how power centralizes around cult of personality figures. He was like very much like, that was like the reason he wrote the Dune books, is like, this is a bad thing.
And people were like, wow, cool. I have a question that maybe you can answer about the worms, because the one thing that really kind of brought me out a couple of times was the fact that they use the worms as transportation, and I just did not understand how. I'm like, these worms are not gonna, like, they're not
like, how do you steer
on like a circle, like they're just hitching. What if the worm decides to go deep? You're dead. Like that so really cut me out
in the book bit. In the book, they go really in depth with, you know, how those hooks go into their particular glands, and like they steer them, right, and causes pain to them. Like if it tries to go under, they like it hurt. They're basically hurting it. And also, I would say it takes multiple Fremen to steer the thing. Like Paul's little John was a short. He went on for like a run round around the block, but like a big worm takes more than one dude. Right, because that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, the way I still think it's silly. Like,
it was a little
like.
I have
how did they slow down the worm enough to get a freaking tent on there so the pregnant lady could sit comfortably? Like, how did they slow the worm down? Like, I loved the scene of, like, I think that the director had said that the book never said explicitly how they get on in the first place. Like, they talked about the hooks, but not how they get on. So he kind of had to imagine what that would look like. And I'll admit I loved it, but I was still a little confused. I'm like, is the sand, like, the sand's collapsing, he's falling. What is that thing that keeps flapping backwards? Is it going to fly off? Like, what is going on here? But yeah, it was,
I mean,
my biggest question was, how do they slow it down? Yeah.
A bigger plot point, a bigger plot hole is sand doesn't transport sound. Right? That actually, totally, sand is actually insulates, is a sound insulation, right? Like you could,
so they wouldn't
if
hear
you compact sound, the worm wouldn't hear shit. Like you could make the argument that, it's got this huge sensitivity to vibration that's insane, but like even then, sand insulates sound. So like you couldn't hear somebody screaming if they were just like 8 feet buried in sand. Like you could Anyway, that's another plot hole. But the one that I thought about in the movie was, are the Harkonnens really that dumb that they don't know? They think there are only 50,000 Fremen, and they're like 5 million, and they're all. I understand that it's all sandstorms, sort of obscure the second half of the planet and all of that stuff, but like, they didn't just go and kill them all earlier. Like, they've been there for 80 years. And the how little information they had on the Fremen, how bad they were at fighting them was, and Frank Herbert's world, his whole plot world building thing is, the stronger the army is directly correlated to how hard the living conditions for that army are, right? So the Emperor's Sardaukar, they are the most inhospitable prison planet. Therefore, they're super fighters. The Fremen, inhospitable, horrible planet, super fighters. And I don't think that really checks out.
Do we think that why the Harkonnens don't do anything about the Southern is just because they're like willfully ignorant? If they're like, oh yeah, they told us it's completely inhospitable, we're not going to go down there.
I think it's that, and it's really expensive, right, and dangerous, right? So you could send people out, and you'll lose men and equipment, right? So, and because the Fremen kind of before Paul were kind of keeping in their own lane, I don't know. It doesn't really matter. I think in the book they were more keeping to themselves, and then the Harkonnen really started doubling down and killing them. And in the movie, they sort of put them as like these freedom fighters from the beginning, which I don't necessarily think would have made sense in a protracted conflict.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I loved Paul's nukes. I love that scene.
Yeah, I was like,
these
what?
are the Atreides nuclear weapons.
I was like, Edith has nukes now?
That made me very happy. That was funny.
The character, the Gurney guy, it felt like he was only there. I mean, he was sort of a what's it called when you're the MacGuffin? Like, it was almost like he kind of that's not quite right, but like he was only there to say, hey, your nukes are here, and to kind of be almost like double up as like a mentor with the mom, to be like, do it, take advantage of them. And Paul's like, oh, okay, yeah.
He's a young boy, you know.
Yeah, why not? But yeah, the nukes, I was just like, what? I don't know. That part was, it felt very fun, but at the same time, I'm like, this just changes so much that now that he has an arsenal of nukes, it almost made the other things feel small in comparison. Because even if like these whole armies are coming to you, if they don't have nukes like you do.
Well, I think it was not so much about an equal, mutually assured destruction conflict. It was more about, I can nuke the spice fields and stop the interstellar economy. If you don't, he like blackmail. Like that was more about that than the Emperor coming at him with his nukes. Yeah, because it's the desert, you know.
Yeah.
Paul was saying, we'll nuke ourselves, which is crazy. Anyway, the knife fight with Fade Routha, the final fight, I thought that last section was incredible. I was so into it, and Austin Butler's performance was great.
He was really good. He still sounds like Elvis. Like, I think that's just maybe part of his personality. But he did a really good job.
Elvis. You saw Elvis in there?
No, heard it. It's his voice. Like,
he's got
even it, because I remember in some of the promo interviews before the movie came out, people were like, "Oh, like, is Austin Butler still doing an Elvis thing, or is this just how he is?" And then watching the movie, I was like, "Yeah, I can still hear it. Like, I can hear that. Like." So I think that maybe that's just how he talks, and maybe that's why he was cast, because like, oh yeah, he's got this like this whole thing with the way he talks.
That's funny. I thought that I couldn't place him. Like, I didn't really look up the cast that much before I went in, and without having like heard his name and just seeing like him completely bald and like as like this tough guy, I just could not place him at all until after. So that was kind of a fun twist, because I'm like, I'm sure that this actor is someone that I should know, but I can't recognize them for whatever reason. So that was a fun reveal for me, as someone who doesn't follow him that much. What is it?
I thought he was Bill Skarsgård for a while. Like, when the movie started, I was like, oh yeah, that's Bill. because his dad's in the movie too. So I'm like, oh, this makes sense. And then there was some kind of angle switch, and I was like, oh no, that's who Austin Butler plays in this movie. And that was really strange for me. I had to like completely rewrap how I was seeing the character in my head.
They did a great job of building him up to seem like this imposing like villain, because when the whole idea of you thought it was a fake, like it was a rigged fight on his birthday, right? Yeah. And the dad and the uncle, Baron Harkonnen, doesn't unrigs it to test him for real, and he wins. And like that was an interesting, like it brought up a lot of it was very interesting and engaging in terms of like what their family dynamic was like, and that he's a scary little dude.
And he enjoyed it, right? Like there was that like moment where he was like, thank you, because that's like the gift, is that he almost killed me.
Yeah. Little psycho kid. Yeah, but it was it's I was kind of surprised that they killed him in this one, because I was feeling like they were building him up for something else, as like to be like a more recurring bad guy. But they axed so many of the villains in this. Like they killed his uncle, they killed him, like everybody was just dying, and I'm like, wow, that's bold. I guess we're gonna have a new antagonist in the next. Tony? Who's that?
Chani.
Oh, she would be a fun antagonist.
She would be like, could you imagine if if they changed it a little bit? I don't know what happens after this, but imagine if she was like, no, you left me, you did all of this stuff, I'm coming for you, I'm keying your car, like.
So Paul's the big baddie. No spoiler, Paul is the big baddie.
But then who's going to be the
baddie?
Yeah, he needs a baddie to his baddie,
everybody, like, everyone. True. He's the emperor. When you're the emperor and you've killed 60 billion people, because there's a 12-year time skip, and he will have killed 60 billion people, subjugating the universe in his name and a religion. And that pisses off a lot of people. So they're new bad guys, I will say. Yeah.
That's going to be an interesting perspective change of like coming from this kind of moment of this high to like, oh,
he's bad.
Yeah, this is how much he's been corrupted by all of this stuff.
It's interesting too, because like, it takes you on a ride that hopefully will be kind of eye-opening to all the people who fell for Paul's charm so quickly, to be like, oh, yeah, I was completely on board with him. I ignored all the signs, and now he's killed billions of people or whatever it is. It kind of reminds me of like Dany in House of the Dragon, like where it's like when you're along for the ride, you're just like, yeah, girl, like kill all those people, like free everyone, do this, burn the whole thing. And then at the end, when she's just torching an entire city, you're like, oh no,
I know these
How
people.
could this be? Where had this come from? I didn't foresee this at all. And then you go back and you watch Game of Thrones again, and you're like, no, this girl was steadily descending into like anti-hero-dom. And
there was an arc.
There was an arc, and I wish that we had a little more time.
They needed exactly. If they had another 2 hour, if they had another 2 to 4 hours to build that up, people would have been totally fine with it.
Yeah.
But yeah, anyway. Yeah,
but
I
even
agree.
So, even so, though, like it was not subtle that she was descending, right? Like it was one of those things where when you were in the moment, people were so on board with her taking power that we didn't really pay attention to her failings and like where she took it too far. And Paul is such a similar character in a way. And it's interesting that we're kind of seeing the end of the Paul that we knew we had the Paul that we knew where he seems like a kid. He seems like a guy trying to do his best. He seems very genuine in the beginning of this movie with the Fremen. Like he's trying to avoid becoming a messiah. He knows that if he goes and he does this, then that's who he'll become, and he wants to avoid it. But then he does it anyway. Like he's convinced to do it anyway. And it's just, I don't know. I love that journey for him. It's anti-heroes are really fun. I'm curious.
Messiah is going to be fun.
Sorry, is that the last one?
It's there are 6 books. We just watched the first one. The first 2 movies of the first book. and then the second book is the end of Paul's story. So Denis Villeneuve only wants to do Paul's story, and then he wants to get
That
out
makes
of Dune
sense.
land.
Because I heard
So he
after
wants to make
Paul,
this
it
kind
gets
of the trilogy.
wild.
Yeah, it gets weird. I'm not saying bad. It's just unadaptable. Like the stuff that you're like, it's really hard beyond the first book, I think, for people. I recommend the first book to anybody who likes science fiction. It's really interesting. I would never recommend any of the rest of the Dune books unless you're like, so all that weird shit in the desert, I want more of that. I want more of the weird drug space stuff with characters' names so I can't pronounce. I want less of like likable characters, story. Like if you're not interested in story and you're just all interested in weird world building and lore, Dune is great.
Maybe I'll check it out. This is an interesting
I don't
point
think
from
so.
Maya. I felt like everything came a bit too easy for Paul. There was little doubt of his powers, which made it harder to connect with him, unlike Paul in part 1. What do you all think?
I think that was by design, right? Like,
yeah, true.
The Bene Gesserit had been doing this. They had been setting all of this up for so long in advance and had so many versions of it because theoretically, right, there's 100 Pauls out there on 100 planets that they've been creating this mythos for so long. And Paul just happens to be the one. He's the one where it all kind of lined up and it all worked. But that could have been any of these other planets. So I think the idea of it is like it came to him because it was created for him. He actually didn't do anything.
Yeah. I do agree, though, that I think that for a lot of the film, there was all these other obstacles that were technically there. But the real obstacle that held him back was his own like unsureness, his own like indecisiveness. He didn't want to commit to it. That was really the only thing that was truly holding him back, was his own indecision and just the fact that he didn't want to. And then the moment that he drank the water of life and he became decisive, he basically didn't slow down. He just steamrolled until the end, like them like coming out of the sandstorm and grabbing people with their legs and doing those crazy moves. The moment that he decided that that's what he wanted, the obstacles became still challenging but surmountable. He didn't really face a massive setback from that point forward, which is kind of interesting to reflect on.
Is he like possessed?
Yeah. No.
No.
But there are people in the Dune world who are and will be. Spoilers. that's book 2 and 3. That's book 3. That's book 3.
Because but, it's like
I agree with this take.
I think Paul's Paul, but it feels like he's just Paul now so Paul. Tainted by all the information, right? That like his lifetime is probably a fraction of everything he knows. Sorry, Adam.
No, that's exactly right. Paul is still. They talk a lot about ego and like consciousness and like. That's why, spoiler alert, this isn't a spoiler for the book or the other adaptations of Dune, but why the Bene Gesserit freak out when they find out about Jessica and her baby is because, oh wait, you have a fetus that has all the memories of thousands of personalities and people, but has not had time to develop its own ego or consciousness. And they freak out and they call that an abomination. And like that's kind of a whole thing. Whereas Paul still has his sense of identity. He just has access to all of this information and insight, which, like you said, corrupts. Which is an interesting idea. Just to bring up Maya's point, I actually agree with this. I think it's interesting that the movie works, but I personally would have liked a little bit more tension at the end, with like the Sardaukar being a little harder to beat, with the Emperor being a little harder to beat. Like, I love the knife fight with Feyd-Rautha. I think that was the first time Paul actually had a real obstacle. Like, I felt like that fight was really hard for him. But in the whole fight and like getting the nukes and the worms attacking, it was glorious. But then like I would have liked a few more Fremen to die, I guess. You can quote me on that.
This is an interesting question too from Oilman. Do we think that the baby is a metaphor for AI?
No, because it's not in the movie.
Yeah.
And AI is in the Dune universe. Yeah.
True. I feel like it's not set up that way, but just, in the same way that like themes that there's like sort of like a cultural consciousness of themes that we're interested in. It's really hard to kind of separate that comparison from what's happening with the baby, where like a computer doesn't have its own personality, but it has all of this information. And similarly, this baby doesn't have a personality yet, but it has all this information. I think it's a really smart comparison, but I don't necessarily think that my impression is not that that was the overt intention with it at first, but
it can go that way.
It can go that way. Yeah, it's like
the metaphor is how you interpret it. So like whether or not the author or the director wanted you to see things a certain way, if you interpret it that way, then it absolutely is a metaphor.
Absolutely. All right, I have to ask, how was the budget under 200 million? I felt like this should have been so much more expensive than it was, with like these giant sandworms, and I don't know, it felt like this should be much more expensive, and it kind of blew my mind.
They were smart about it though, right? Like a lot of scenes, they're just sand in the background, right?
True.
I think another question, the other question is really, why are other movies so expensive, right? Because I feel like there's a lot of, especially we look at the Disney Marvel films, which have these bloated, especially in the last 8 to 10 years, huge budgets. And then like some visual effects shots, you're like, that doesn't look very good, right? Like you're like, where did the $280 million go? Like, and I think there are some films that are coming out now that are really maximizing their visual effects budgets. And like one thing that I think Denis Villeneuve does, which is he doesn't have green screen. He has like kind of like fabrics that match the texture of the space, and like a lot of things that make like, so they still use compositing techniques. It's just the lighting effect. They don't have to spend time dealing with green screen spill, right? Things look more integrated because it's associated with the colors, and with new technology, you don't have to worry about that as much. And there's a lot of like really smart like location scouting, maximizing the resources you have. The other film that is very notable for its visual effects budget is Godzilla -1. That film was made for $35 million, and it looks like $100 million movie, right? Like you don't have to just throw money at something. Just because you throw money at something doesn't mean it ends up on the screen. It could go to name actors. It could go to expensive reshoots. It could go towards a lot of things, right? And I just think this movie was just well planned and executed. And like another example is Oppenheimer was barely $100 million, right? Yeah. And that film was done in like a month. They shot it in like record time. They only had like 2 to 3 takes per scene.
That's wild.
So it's just smart planning.
And then Esha, who was on the VFX team for this movie, said, "We got the storyboards really early on. Denis was decisive on major shots pertaining to his notes, and pre-production was well planned." So
there you go.
Make all the difference.
Smart spending. It's really interesting that I think you're right, Adam, that it's less of a question of how is this so cheap and just more like, where does the money go on the other ones? Like, what are they doing? And it's also just cool that technology is getting to the point where the budgets kind of can lower a bit, where to achieve the same level that would have cost so much more before, now we can get there with less money and just more careful planning. It's pretty freaking neat. The last question that I have for you all is, I mean, maybe this isn't the best one to end with. It's just one I was thinking about is, would this movie have ever been made if it was not an adaptation? No. Would any version of this ever be made if it wasn't an adaptation?
40 years ago, maybe. Maybe.
This as a spec.
Not
can
like
you
this.
Imagine this as a spec script?
I wish.
And I can imagine people putting it in the pile directly after, you gotta, I mean, this is a very valuable IP. The book has sold 60 million copies. The reason why it didn't get done sooner is because of the perceived curse, right? Every time it was somebody tried to adapt it, it was a gigantic nightmare and it fell apart, right? Like
have you seen the recent, not the recent, the David Lynch's version and the whatever.
I've seen every version.
But like recently, like the special effects they use when they're fighting with the shields.
Yeah,
it's so good.
Yeah,
it's so
rough.
Good. It's hilarious.
Yeah,
but yeah,
I actually like the original Dune. That was a great documentary. If you're interested in learning about this director, didn't even finish the book and wanted to make a 12-hour version, and he got Pink Floyd to do the soundtrack. He was going to pay Orson Welles $100,000 an hour. He was on set, but it was a very interesting. He was going to cast his son as Paul and make it a metaphor. That it was crazy documentary. I highly recommend it.
And the visuals, like his storyboards, I would love to get a hand, like, to get that book and see it, the whole thing, because the visuals are really bizarre.
Oh yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, and a lot of people who were very foundational in a lot of science fiction films later, like Alien and Blade Runner, worked on that failed film. But the David Lynch Dune is really interesting. Apparently, it was originally 3.5 hours, and then the studio said cut an hour and a half, and they cut an hour and a half, and that's why the movie you watch, the current movie, is pretty rough for that reason.
Well, it's all voiceover too, right?
It's all voiceover. Also, I don't think it was a good adaptation either, because it's literally the book, right?
Yeah.
And the book has a lot of characters thinking thoughts, and so we hear a voiceover of the character thinking the thought, and it's so goofy, right? Whereas they do a great job in this film of using Timothée Chalamet's mournful face well, like using great visuals of like, oh, his hand touches the water, right, in the first film for the last time, right? We don't need to hear him say, wow, I'm never going to see Caladan again, right? Like the Denis Villeneuve is really good at using visuals and great actors who are very charismatic to fill non-roles. Like so many of the characters in the original Dune book are like stock characters that have no personality whatsoever, right? Sorry, I like the book, but it's true, right? Paul is like a nothing character. He's a Mary Sue, right? Yeah. Timothée Chalamet brought a lot of personality and life to this character, and he the same with the Skarsgård. I thought he did.
Yeah, I thought so in the first one too. I remember all of his lines were like so flat, and also just kind of like written. Like if you just read it on a page, if I read it on a page as someone who's not an actor, it was like it did not give you much at all, and it was very like they write in kind of this weirdly formal way, like we must go. And it was like, I was impressed that he was able to bring as much emotion and depth to those lines as he did, because just like listening to it and trying to imagine seeing that on the page, I'd be like, this is so boring. Like, you're not giving this guy anything to work with. And he somehow made it lively and interesting. I think he did awesome. But
I buy his character. I think he's a good actor. I don't think that Paul is an incredibly interesting character.
No, I don't think so either. I'm just saying they cast actors who can breathe life into flat characters. Like Paul is not an interesting character, but I could watch him because I think Timothée Chalamet is interesting. That's what I was trying to say.
Yeah, I like him a lot. I think he's talented, and I don't know. There's something about him. He's got something like I don't know.
He's the new Leo.
The new Leo. Oh God, I hope not. Leo.
Romeo
Leonardo is a great actor. No,
he's
Leonardo
a wonderful actor.
Great actor. Wonderful actor. Lots of personal life. I don't care, but yeah. I don't know.
That's all I meant. He can be the new actor like that. That's okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, everybody. It was really fun to talk about Dune Part 2 with all of you, and we hope that you will be back next week. See ya. Okay, everybody. We are now in the little whatever it's called, after chat Q&A section. So we're happy to kind of chat a little bit more casually, answer any questions that you might have. Jim said, did you guys read Denis saying that he hates dialogue and prefers to using image to tell the story? He was getting a lot of flack, but I get his point.
I didn't, but I love it. He trusts the audience, and you can tell that he's trusting you to get it, right? And not everyone's going to get it, but I prefer that in a film, is to get like a really great image to tell me the story.
It is interesting because people definitely don't get it, So
Yeah.
like people are definitely walking away with the wrong impression. So it's interesting because I think the criticism
but it's
is
about the small things. But it's about the small things I think they do, right? Like big plot sense. I think that's more of the writer problem, right? Like as a director, though, he like makes a choice a lot of the time to
oh
like
yeah.
show like subtle things, like, oh, the character cares about this, right? Like, or they are where Paul looks mournfully at the sunset, on the
Yeah.
rather than having like a big exposition thing, right?
Or like showing him doing the walk, like that dance walk that they do. Like to me, that showed me, okay, one, he has spent some time with these people, and two, like he's done enough learning of their culture that he understands how to do this weird little dance walk in such a way that it is like virtually indistinguishable from the natural people. And that I thought was a great moment of like, okay, just from that image, I can make the inference that he's learned this culture to like an extended degree.
And that he like had respect for it was also the
Yeah.
impression that I got, was that, he was doing all of these things that he didn't necessarily have to become Fremen, but that was something that he was kind of choosing to go all the way.
And it could have been dialogue, like that choice could have been made in dialogue by saying, oh wow, you respect us so much or whatever, right?
Adam, you have a
Thank you. I have
fan.
fans. Thank you.
Adam wrote that himself.
Yeah,
I'm
Adam
blushing.
signed it.
Yeah, I actually have a second account, and I'm like,
here is like another question from Esha. You already answered this already in a way, but what do you think? Do you think there was a transfer of mentor roles? Do you think the mentor changed in the movie from Rebecca, the mom till moments of Paul consuming the water? Oh, do we think that the mentor went from the mom, who Jessica, to Gurney when he showed up?
my opinion is, you go, Alexie, you go.
I think that I would say it doesn't necessarily transfer. I still think that narratively the mom is fulfilling the mentor role in a much more direct way. Like she holds the inner need that Paul comes to believe, which is him taking on this role of a messiah. And I think that Gurney is another character who certainly guides him, but his answer is a little bit different than the one that Paul comes to. Gurney is kind of like, it doesn't matter if it's real. You have an opportunity to get power. And the mom is like, this is the truth and you need to embrace it. And so it's a little bit of a nuanced point of view that guide him in the same direction, but for slightly different reasons. And Paul's choice in the end more directly aligns with his mom's, which is like, that this is real. I'm legit. I'm not just using this to get power, but it does get me power. So
Or
that
so
would be,
like us to believe.
What is it?
I said, or so he would like us to believe.
Yeah, exactly. I would say that. So yeah, for that reason, narratively, I would say that I don't think there was actually like a mentor switch, but I do think that the role of Gurney, he did have like some mentor-like qualities. I think his primary purpose was just the nukes. That was was, I think, his role more so than the mentorship or anything else, was get Paul the nukes. That's why he was there.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Gurney's character in the book is, it doesn't really, like I said, the book has a lot of stock characters, right? Like there's the teacher, the father, the mother, the ultimate villain, right? Like it's very, he exists to get the nuclear warheads, and also he's very religious in the books. So a lot of lines about like him quoting what's called the Catholic Orange Bible in the Dune universe. It's like Islam and Catholicism combined over 20,000 years.
Called?
Yeah, I think it's the Orange Catholic Bible. You can check me on that. But after the Butlerian Jihad, which is where the AI almost destroyed humanity, and they had to like humanity had like figure out its new like principles of how to live, and it has in the book there's a lot of things about like, you shall never create a machine in the likeness of a human mind. You can never do X, Y, Z. And like the whole culture in the Dune universe and the Imperium is designed kind of around this mainstream religion. But then there's the Bene Gesserit who are seeding false prophecies about their own religion because they realize how useful that is. Anyway, Gurney's really religious, and he reads from his book, and he literally exists in the book to like quote passages about the Butlerian Jihad and to tell him where the nukes are.
That's interesting.
Yeah, God, I'm looking at the Dune fandom, like wiki fandom right now, and it's just so much of like a rabbit hole. God.
It really is.
It's like every single page has like 17 interior links to other things. Does YS have a tentpole / beat sheet of Dune 2? We do not right now.
We can make one.
Yeah, we could. We can. We will work on that, and we can share it in the Discord. But that's a good question. I think that's all of the questions that we had from the Q&A section. Let me just make sure I didn't miss anything while we went live. I think that's it. But cool.
Great.
Thank you so much for coming, everybody, today. And we will see you next week.
Have a great weekend.
Bye.